Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupyansk frontline. First we will start with the Kupyansk and Lyman frontline. We'll go fast through these front lines and then we will discuss Bakhmut and we will try to understand what is going on in Bakhmut. The Russian Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of artillery duels and artillery attacks on the Kupyansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 30 soldiers, 1 tank and 2 artillery systems. The front line is stable. There are heavy clashes in the vicinity of Novoselovskaya, between Stelimakhovka and Novoselovka, but also without any changes on the ground. When talking about Lyman frontline, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on this frontline, the Ukrainians lost 125 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. So as you can see, the level of losses is still on the high level, but as you can see, there are no changes on the ground. The Russians continue their offensive operation in Serebrenka forest and are continuing the blockade operation of Yampolovka and Terny. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. As you can see, there are not much icons in this area. The Russian source map has been updated. As you can see, according to this map, the Russians established control over the east-north part of Bakhmut, over the central-east part, and over the south part. There are 2 areas on this bank of Bakhmutka river, this one on the north and the south one. So I believe that when talking about the north part, the Ukrainians still have some rearguard forces, but I believe that maybe tomorrow or the day after, this map is going to be updated. And when talking about the south, I just believe that there are no proper information about this area, but I believe that this area is under Russian control. Now let's talk about Bakhmut one more time. Today we have a lot of interesting piece of news about this area, and the most important is that the head of Wagner's, Prigozhin, reported that there are still around from 12 till 20,000 soldiers inside of Bakhmut. So this is the words of the head of Wagner's, from 12,000 soldiers till 20,000 soldiers. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu, also today reported that during the clashes in February, the Ukrainians lost around 11,000 soldiers. And mainly those losses were in Bakhmut and the vicinity of Bakhmut. So imagine yourself, there are still from 12 till 20 and like something around 11,000 were killed or wounded during the February. So like 33% if we calculate everything. Now let's try to understand the situation in Bakhmut. As you can see, some Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians continue or their retreat operation, that they're moving their parts from Bakhmut under fire. We understand that Ukrainians are able to use just the road and the roads between Ivanovskaya and, let's say, Khromova. These areas, they're going along the road and they're turning to the north in this forest and they're trying to cross this channel and they're entering Chasov Yar. So this is the only possible solution for the Ukrainians, and we know that the Russians establish artillery control. They're attacking this area 24 hours per day without non-stop attacking, non-stop shelling, and the Ukrainians do have a very high level of losses. Also, we know that Ukrainians a few days ago, the president and the general staff took a decision not to step back from Bakhmut and to continue clashes inside this town. Yesterday we discussed about the possible options. Why did the general staff of Ukraine took such a decision? The first one is that they are no longer able to do this. The second one is that it was some kind of media action just to reduce the negative negative situation in society and in military and so on. And as I understand, the thing is that the Ukrainians, as I understand from analysis we have, from the situation we have, from the numbers we have, the Ukrainians are no longer able to evacuate their forces through Bakhmut, just through this area. Just imagine yourself, if we can believe the words of Prigozhin, the head of Wagner's, there are around from 12 till 20,000 soldiers inside this town. Just imagine yourself if the general staff of Ukraine take a decision to step back from Bakhmut. Imagine yourself, 12,000 army in a second, in one day, try to cross these fields. Of course, they will be destroyed completely without any questions, without any doubts. So the thing is that the Ukrainians are no longer able to evacuate from Bakhmut. Maybe that was such a political decision. Maybe that was some kind of tactic, like to that there are there are no way back, there are no way to retreat. So we need to fight, and we need to show the rest of Ukrainian army that it is possible to fight and it is possible to defeat the Russians or to stand or hold this or that town. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost just 75 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and 2 artillery systems, 1 Smerch, another D-30 howitzer. Furthermore, when talking about other town from this front line, the Russians reported about destroying of ammo depot in Avdiivka, and also the Ukrainians lost another radar, ANTPQ-37, a little bit to the north in the vicinity of Chasov Yar, this one. It is something like a counter-artillery duels radar. This radar allows the Ukrainians to spot and discover Russian artillery positions. So as you can see, according to the numbers, this is the lowest level of losses among the Ukrainians since the beginning of storming of Bakhmut, just 75 soldiers, and that these numbers tells a lot. And of course there are also a lot of options why the losses are so low. And the first thing is that, as we know, if we take a look at the Western sources map, we're going to see almost the same picture, that the Western source map has been updated as well. As you can see, they're showing that the north part in the vicinity of Mid Tower Plant, this area is under complete Russian control. The Russians also, as we discussed at the beginning of this part, have established control over like a lot of territories on the east. So maybe that was the reason why the losses were at so low level, because the Ukrainians stepped back and the Russians now need time to clear this area, to demine this area, and just to capture and establish their new positions. This is like the first thing, and that there were no clashes, at least in the east part, because there were like no possibilities to have clashes because of absence of Ukrainian army on this bank of the river. Another possible solution is that the Russians on the north took their positions, and now they understand that they don't need to develop their bridgehead more, at least at this stage of operation. They have already encircled, cut the roads, and they now the only type of forces that these days need to fight and to provide some results is artillery and air forces. The infantry and stormtroopers, they have done their job, and they don't need to do anything more. They don't need to enter Bakhmut because they will be reduced and they will be destroyed. They don't need to continue storming. They did everything they need. They made like the road, the only possible road, under fire control, and now their main job is to hold their positions, to prepare fortifications, to prepare positions that they need to keep as long as possible while artillery and air forces do their job. And now because of the fact that Ukrainians took a decision not to step back from Bakhmut, we will return back to this situation one more time. That means that the Russians changed their tactics, and now they understand that they need just to hold the bridgehead and to do something with the bridgehead around Bakhmut. They don't need to storm. Everything is perfect for them. The situation is in Russian favor. Anyway, if you want to supply 12,000 army in Bakhmut, you need to provide them with food, with ammo, with shield. You need to make rotation. You need to take wounded from this town. You need to bring more fresh forces. And anyway, in 2 months of blockade, the Ukrainians will lose many soldiers, many forces, many armored vehicles during this process. So for now, the Russians have a perfect position. It's a perfect trap. It's a perfect trap that Ukrainians don't have solution how to avoid this trap, how to reduce the consequences of this trap, and how to deblockade Bakhmut. And we will talk about this a little bit like right now. So the thing is that, as I told you, now the second phase of battle for Bakhmut has started, and this is the phase of artillery and air forces, air forces, and the bridgehead. But the bridgehead is something like the same as artillery systems and air force, so it's like the main part. Now the main part is the bridgehead in the vicinity of Bakhmut, around Bakhmut, not in the area between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut, but around Bakhmut. This is the most important part, and this is the part where the artillery and air forces should show what they can do from both sides. And which parties, artillery forces and air forces, wins this battle, this party is going to win the entire battle for Bakhmut. Now I'll try to explain to you. The thing is, like, let's return back to the Western sources map and so on. As I told you, the Bakhmut is under blockade, and this road is under very heavy fire. And every single day, the Russians are able to move more closer to Bakhmut. Their artillery systems, mortars, mines, and so on. And with this, they're able to establish more tough, more heavy control over this area that will bring more and more losses among the Ukrainians. So that means that if there are 12,000 army from 12 till 20, that means that the Ukrainians need to restore the roads to this town and to deblockade these forces. So there are the Ukrainians can deblockade forces from the south, let's say from Chasov Yar, Klishevka, but I don't think so, because to deblockade such a town you need to use armored vehicles. And if we take a look at the south, you're going to see that there is a channel and not many places where the Ukrainians are able to cross the channel and to attack Bakhmut from the south for deblockading process. So that's mean we understand that Ukrainians can't use the south area for deblockation of Bakhmut. Now let's talk about the middle part. This area is under fire control. One more time, you need to use tanks and to attack the Ukrainians in Yagidne, in Berkhovka, or in Klishevka from, let's say, the town by the name of Canal. This one is also not an option because you won't be able to achieve success and you will be destroyed by the artillery. Another area for deblockation is to attack from Bogdanovka, Grigorievka, Reka Vasilievka in direction of Dubovo, Vasilievka, Berkhovka, and so on. So this area, this bridgehead, is also not an option because if you want to attack somehow, you need to deploy tanks and to move tanks on this line and then to attack. And there are also not many places where the Ukrainians are able to cross and to move tanks. And furthermore, even in this case, you're going to attack through fields that has a very poor condition right now, and the tanks and armored vehicles might stuck on the ground and they will be attacked by the Russians. So the only possible way where the Ukrainians are able to attack the Russians is from Slaviansk in direction of, let's say, Paraskovievka, along the road MO3. So this is the only way, the only road that Ukrainians are able to use to attack the Russians on the north of Bakhmut. And the Russian sources are saying, and the Ukrainian source confirms, that these days, these hours, the Ukrainians have already accumulated their forces around this road, somewhere on the northwest from Fyodorovka, from Privilya, from Rai-Alexandrovka, in this area, fist of Ukrainian tanks. Furthermore, if we take a look at deployment map, you're gonna see that, let's take a look, let's zoom this area, and you're gonna see that this is the area of responsibilities of 1st Tank Brigade and of the 17th Tank Brigade. Furthermore, there is another 61st Mechanized Brigade. So there are a lot of mechanized parts in this area, and there are a lot of artillery positions of the Ukrainians. So this is the only way where that Ukrainians are able to use for attack. And furthermore, a lot of Ukrainian and officers, soldiers on the ground, military people on the ground are saying that this is exactly what the Ukrainians are doing right now. So they need to deblockade Bakhmut, and the only possible solution is to attack from Slaviansk in direction of Paraskovievka and to force the Russians to leave this bridgehead on, let's say, Solidar side of Bakhmut. So this is the only option. So if the Ukrainians want to evacuate 12,000 army from Bakhmut, they need to attack this bridgehead and to try to return this area. There is no other option, or they will lose their 12,000 army inside of Bakhmut. It will be destroyed by the Russians within a month or two, and furthermore, the Ukrainians will just burn all their reserves and all their everything they have in this battle. And this is the reason also why the Russians stopped and slowed down, because now the Russians also understand that it's won't going to be a very easy job. They need to keep this bridgehead. They will be attacked. Furthermore, if you remember, the Russians are located in the lowland, and Ukrainians will attack from the hills. And now the Russians need just one thing: to prepare the trenches, to prepare the bridgehead, and to meet their guests properly. So, and when talking about the Ukrainians, they also have a very poor positions. First of all, as you can see, they will attack along the MO3 roads, and there is a very short area where they can move their tanks in this position. So this is the only small neck of the battle that Ukrainians are able to use to move their tanks, let's say, to Orehov Vasilievka and to Zaliznyanska and to Vasikovka. So I believe that this area is under Russian artillery control. I'm not sure that the Russians are so flexible and mobile to attack this area, because there is some kind of counter artillery duels from the Ukrainian side. But anyway, at least the Russians are able to control and to calculate and to see the pressure and to see the value, the amount of tanks, and to understand the risk. So this is the only possible solution, that Ukrainians are able not to attack but to move armored vehicles in these directions. Very short area. They can't use the broad frontline attacks. And the thing is that when talking about the west part, there is a channel, and the northeast there is another river that it's difficult. They need to attack between these two water barriers. Furthermore, and this is the area that Ukrainians are able to deploy their armored forces. And if they take a decision to attack, there are not much positions. First from Vasikovka in direction of Sakov-on-Seti, another one between these two water reservoirs. I'm talking about this one, and the third one between from Zaliznyanska, of course, and along MO3. So there are not much places to attack the Russians. Believe me, the Ukrainians are going to have significant losses during this attack. And the main reason is that it's not time for such a broad frontline attack. If it was May, or at least the second half of April, or at least the April, I don't know, but not the beginning of March, the Ukrainians would have more chances, because in this case they would be able to stretch their forces along this short neck of attack. But if we're talking about the beginning of March, they will be forced to accumulate tanks into convoys and columns to attack, and just for a short period of time they will be able to stretch their forces for some attack, and all this time the Ukrainians will be under artillery attack from the Russian side. So but at the beginning of this discussion I told you that this is operation of artillery systems and of air attacks, air forces. Why is that? As we discussed yesterday, we understand that the Russians control this area by artillery attacks. So let's mark this as a cloud. So this area is under complete Russian artillery control. They attack this area mainly, as I understand, from the west, from the east, somewhere from these positions. Because they attack from this position for one reason, because this bridgehead is located as far as possible from this area. As we discussed discussed yesterday, the Ukrainians uses this bridgehead to attack the Russians artillery from the south, and they need this area as much as possible. And the second area that Ukrainians uses, even according to the deployment map, we see that right behind this tank phase, the Ukrainians deploy their artillery forces. So this is the second bridgehead that Ukrainians uses to attack the Russians and pin down the Russians' artillery system. So now you understand that from one positions, this bridgehead is important for the Ukrainians, and the most important part that Ukrainians need to do right now is to reduce the Russian bridgehead on the north, and they need to bring as close as possible their artillery systems to this railroad on the north and on the south, with one purpose: to force the Russians' artillery system to move from this position a little bit further to the east, somewhere, let's say somewhere here. And from these positions, at least at these positions, the Russians can feel themselves, the Russians' artillery systems can feel themselves safe. But from this position, they are no longer able to attack this bridgehead, or at least not every single type of Russian artillery are able to reach this position. So now this is the war for bridgeheads around Bakhmut. But from the Russian side, they also understand that if the Russians, let's say, are able to defeat the Ukrainians' blockade operation on the north of Bakhmut, and if they're able to organize a very powerful counterattack in this area, and if the Russians are able, let's say, to take control over this bridgehead, over this small neck of this bottle, let's say, and this will force the Ukrainian artillery systems to step back further to the northwest, let's say, somewhere here. So they will be forced to move their artillery system here, and from these positions the Ukrainians are no longer able to attack the Russians, and the Russians won't have any problems in artillery duels. Bakhmut will be not just encircled, it will be like operational, tactical encirclement, cauldron, every types of encirclement we can imagine. The Bakhmut will appear there because the Ukrainians won't be able, if the Russians are able to develop their bridgehead to the north, to provide successful or effective artillery duels, at least from this side of, let's say, of Bakhmut. And the same situation in the south. I believe that during the next weeks, the Russians will concentrate their forces to take control over Stupachki, Pritechina. So, as we discussed many videos ago, to get as close as possible to Toretsk with the same purpose, to secure the Russians' artillery systems from the south. They don't need to storm Toretsk, but they need to push the Ukrainians' artillery systems as far as possible. And the same situation from that moment, the Ukrainians, let's say if they take a decision to attack or to suppress the Russians' artillery from Toretsk, they're no longer able to get the Russian artillery systems. And from that very moment, the Russians will feel themselves pretty secured, and from that moment they will be able to establish 24-hour control attack of this area without any consequences. And the only possible weapon that Ukrainians are able to use to suppress the Russian artillery is HIMARS, or let's say M77 and Excalibur shells and so on. But we know that the Ukrainians have lack of this weapon, and furthermore, if the Ukrainians take a decision to use these types of weapons to suppress Russian artillery, they will be forced to discover their position, and of course at that moment the Russian air forces and the Russian counter artillery will take a significant role to suppress the Western artillery system. So the situation for Bakhmut is critical, and this is a disaster. And I believe that within the next few days we are going to see this counter-offensive operation from the north, and the Ukrainians are not prepared for this operation. They don't have and the main reason is the weather, of course, the weather, and the weather, the ground, the weather, and the situation that they will have a very short bridgehead, very short area to attack, and this area will be covered by the artillery. I'm not saying that Ukrainians can't do this. They can do this. But the question is which price the Ukrainians will be forced to pay for this operation. And maybe the price that they're going to pay for this operation is not, we can't like, so how to say this, the price may be too big. The price for Bakhmut can be for the Ukrainians too big, and I'm not saying that the Russians need to take Bakhmut at all. We discussed this many times. The most important thing is to reduce the Ukrainian army and not to allow them to prepare their forces before spring offensive operation. The Ukrainians can push the Russians from this bridgehead in direction of Solidara and to establish frontline along the Bakhmut river and so on. They will lose the east part and so on, but they may lost, as we discussed, just in February they lost around 11,000 soldiers. And if the Ukrainians loses another 20,000 soldiers with armored vehicles during the counter-offensive blockade operation, so the question, does it worth it? I think it's not. And from the other side, the Russians will be completely ready for their greatest offensive operation, and it will be just a question of time when they will reduce and destroy the Ukrainian armies in the levels they need. Now let's move to the south, and let's move to Avdiivka. Many interesting pieces of news are coming from Avdiivka. Now, on this video, I will try to discuss the situation just on the ground, about the possible solutions of movements and so on. I want to, within the next hours, maybe to make another episode, I would like to discuss one important thing that I mentioned, a new type of analysis I try to use during this situation, during the analysis of special operation, and it will be very interesting. But for now, I just want to tell you that the Russians have activated in the vicinity of Avdiivka. And I believe that Maybe this is not strategic goal like to destroy the entire Ukrainian army, but I understand that the facts and the numbers are saying that the Russians, maybe after Bakhmut or while the Bakhmut operation, they will start doing something around Avdiivka. There are very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Novobakhmutovka. There are very heavy clashes on the north of Peski and Opytne, Vadiana in this area, and the Russians pushes in direction of Tonyinka and Severna, and I think that maybe within the next few weeks they are going to take these towns, but we will discuss this in my next video when I will show you something very interesting. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk. There are not much updates, as you can see. As a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems, one M109 howitzer and another M777 Hordet. Furthermore, also they lost another D30 howitzer. Zaporozhye, there are no changes on the ground, just artillery duels and so on, without any movements. Furthermore, today there was a prisoners exchange. The Ukrainians are saying that they got 130 Ukrainian soldiers. The Russians are saying that they received 90 Russian soldiers. When talking about Kherson, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels on this front line, the Ukrainians lost 35 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems D30, also without any changes on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.